Good. And the webinar is now live.
Brilliant. Wow. Welcome back, everybody. And now we've got a really interesting discussion, which
so
probably would take...
going up.
Are we going up?
Numbers are going up. Yeah, 1774.
And so it would probably take us 3 hours or so, but we're not. We're going to, so everybody's got to be pretty much on time because we're going to try and finish by 10 to 5. But we've got such interesting people on this discussion panel, and they're going to be such interesting, exchanges. So we want you to keep going on the chat show, or no, Q&A, aren't we, April? Q&A.
Yeah.
And so keep putting questions in, but we will deal with those at the end so that we can address them to particular people. I think that's the only way to do this, otherwise we'll take too long. So we chose the Anthropocene, but when did it begin? So man altering the environment, did it begin in the Stone Age, and what's happened really recently? So we've got really good people to talk about some of the changes that are happening. In my lifetime, such a lot has happened, changes in agriculture, loss of sulfur dioxide, increase of nitrogen, all this. Well, you're going to argue about that, but I think, and when I've been working in the tropics, my God, we have lost, amazing forests to palm oil, rainforests to palm oil plantations. So these huge changes are happening in relation to man's activities. So they've started a long time ago, and they've produced, in the end, a mosaic of habitats, some of which have continued to support lichens in a way that very different from what they would have, what they would have been found in naturally. So I think there's a lot to talk about, really, both in terms of good and bad. So we've put together such a good group of people to discuss this. We've got Chris Ellis from the Royal Botanic Gardens, Edinburgh, but also editor of the Lichenologist. So he's seen all those papers flooding in. And we've got Peter Crittenden, so ex-editor and of the Lichenologist, but of course Peter's main interest now can go back to his effects of nitrogen on heathlands and other places. I mean, he's also worked a lot abroad in different places. We've got you Ray Woods, extraordinary naturalist. I would call you, what do I call you, Ray? I call you a lichenologist, a mycologist, a naturalist, and somebody who lots of you will have known. And he's got a special passion about changes in Wales at the minute, which I'm sure he will talk to you about. He's also probably going to talk to you about transplants. And then last of all, but not least, Neil. So Neil, really, who began his work with Francis Rose in the New Forest. So it's a huge continuum of work for which he now works all over Britain and also on the continent. So that's our panel. And so we've designed these questions, and April's going to take over now. Have I said everything? I should have said about Neil, yes, because I asked him for his title with the BLS Conservation Committee. He's the England Conservation Coordinator. I thought it was a good title, Neil. So on we go. April, how are we going to go?
I'm the vice president for my sins, but yeah.
And you are vice president, that's in my list too, but I can't read it. My glasses aren't good enough. Yes, so you'll be president next year.
Good.
So, April, over to you. She's going to moderate us and control us. So,
okay. Thank you, Pat. This is really great. So here is how we're hoping the next hour is going to work. We are going to have a discussion focusing on lichens in a rapidly changing environment, where we will take our 4 panellists through 2 pre-prepared questions, which I will attempt to moderate. Just a reminder to our panellists, you have 5 minutes each. I repeat, 5 minutes for each question, although I can already predict that my time management is going to be shocking. But anyhow, it's all for good discussion, so it's just fine. These questions are going to cover some of the past, the present, and the future threats that lichens are facing, alongside some of the conservation measures that are going to be required to mitigate against any negativities. At the end of the 2 questions, we will have some time set aside for final thoughts from our panellists, and this will be followed by any questions that have come in through the question and answers box, which Pat is going to kindly moderate. So everyone, please do keep the questions flowing in, and we hope to answer them at the end if we do have time. So our first question that we would like to ask our panellists is, which human activities do you feel have the most significant impacts on lichens and their associated habitats? So Chris, are we all right to start with you?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here with you. So, which activities have significant impacts? I'm going to start quite general, and I'm going to take a historic perspective on that question, with the statement that impacts on lichens are multifaceted and they change in importance over time. So, if we look at a lichen distribution today, like a dot map, like the kind of maps we see, for example, in Dobson, you see a snapshot of where a lichen might occur, and it reflects a legacy of historic effects and, to a certain degree, recent impacts. And over years or decades, those distributions are in flux, and they change over time. And to exemplify that, we can show that for certain regions of England, up to 80% of lichen epiphyte diversity was lost during the period before through to after the Industrial Revolution. And that's because of both things like sulfur dioxide, air pollution, plus losses in native woodland or the abandonment of traditional management. But despite those impacts, we can still detect a signature of change in species distributions during that same period caused by the warming of the climate at the end of the Little Ice Age. So there's our first 3 interlayered impacts that have resulted in today's species distributions. Sulfur dioxide pollution's declined, and a recent study using BLS record data showed that lichen occurrences in 2015 were 36% higher and more extensive compared to 1970. And for many regions, we see a recovery in lichens into our countryside and into our urban landscapes. But again, that recovery, it's not even. And when lichen recovery was studied in the Netherlands by Kok van Herk and colleagues, they showed that the lichens recovering was skewed towards nitrogen tolerant species and species that were more warmth loving than might be expected. And when we look at trends for specific species or specific groups of species, so for example, species that are dependent on long ecological continuity, we find that those species haven't recovered and they continue to decline. And so it's this mixture of impacts, past impacts, the legacy of sulfur dioxide, changes in woodland management over time, and then current impacts like nitrogen pollution and human-induced climate change. And they intermix to create this very complicated picture, this layered set of problems that are experienced by lichens and that are impacting them today. So there's my answer. I kind of wanted to take a kind of historic long view on all those different impacts that create this complexity.
That's brilliant, Chris. Thank you so much. For me, with that, your first point with regarding to how human impacts accumulate over time, I think is such an important point. And I think sometimes this is often forgotten, and it's this really long history, I guess, of intervention that has shaped the natural environment as we see it today. And understanding the past is paramount to understanding what's going to go on in the future, and I guess allowing us to plan for that. So thank you. Peter, over to you. What do you perceive to be the biggest human impacts in the habitats that you work in?
Well, I'm specifically talking about heathlands. That was my remit. And the two principal threats are nitrogen deposition and management. Now, nitrogen deposition globally has increased 3 times since 1850. In northern temperate regions, it's increased by a factor of 4 on average, but there are hotspots where the increase is up to a factor of 16. In Britain, the hotspot areas for nitrogen deposition are in the Lake District and in southern Scotland and Galloway, but most of England and Wales is impacted by chronic nitrogen deposition, nitrogen eutrophication. Now, nitrogen deposition is a major threat, not just in Britain, but throughout temperate regions. It's changing the ecology of low productivity, nitrogen poor ecosystems, and heathlands is one of these. The nitrogen enrichment raises the fertility of heathland soils. It increases the growth rate of some of the characteristic plants of heathlands, heather, for example, and perhaps even more important, it promotes the invasion by faster growing, more nitrogen demanding species, including grasses such as Deschampsia and Molinia. And the soil surface often becomes choked by bryophytes such as Hypnum jutlandicum. And so this leads to the shading out of or the competitive exclusion is the appropriate term, of lichens. It's difficult to, you might ask the question, well, are there also toxic effects of these high rates of nitrogen deposition on particular species? And I think in heathlands, this is difficult to tease apart from the competitive exclusion process. I work predominantly with Cladonia portentosa. That's my sort of pet species, model species, and that occurs quite widely across the Lake District, which is including in those areas with the highest modeled nitrogen deposition. So nitrogen deposition per se doesn't appear to be damaging to that species, but other changes like nitrogen enrichment does. Now, the other management, the relaxation or removal of traditional management methods for heathlands, burning and grazing, usually low density to moderate density stocking with animals, these often lapse. They stop when heathlands are not used in the traditional purposes, or if they become nature reserves, you know, they're just these practices in the past have often just elapsed, or inappropriate management for mainly the high density stocking of heathlands with animals has caused damage through grazing and trampling. Grazing, if we're talking about deer, and if we go further afield, reindeer in the tundra, where there are devastating effects of grazing. And the relaxation of management, again, has led to mature and over mature canopies of heather, which cast deep shade, again, competitive exclusion for lichens. So those are the sort of general problems for heathlands. And if I've got time for a brief anecdote, which is outside Britain, I used to do a number of, well, I've been involved in a number of projects in the Russian tundra, in the European Russian tundra, just to the west of the Ural Mountains in the Komi Republic. And we were astonished there. We were meant to be collecting cladinas, Cladonia, arbuscula and stellaris, and over hundreds of square kilometers of tundra. It was difficult to find these. Was this really the effect of reindeer? I mean, these are vast areas, but it seemed to be that it was. And the final clue was that when we were flying in a helicopter over the tundra, you would every now and again pass over a derelict site where they had done drilling for oil and gas. And these areas were oases surrounded, they were yellow, they stood out in the landscape. And the reason was that the reindeer herders kept their reindeer away from these sites because of the metal debris, which would damage the animals. So, and because reindeer are very precious to the reindeer herders. So the reindeer herders kept, it was an inadvertent exclusion experiment. The reindeer herders kept the reindeer away from those sites, and the mat-forming lichens proliferated. So, and these are other vast areas, and there are other equivalent stories from northern Norway, for example, what I could regale you with, but I don't have time. So, nitrogen deposition and management issues.
That's brilliant, Peter. Thank you so much. So I'm actually from the southwest of England, and I've got Exmoor and Dartmoor on my doorstep. I'm very lucky indeed. And I do just everything you've said. I find it so staggering just how susceptible these upland heaths or moorland type habitats are to environmental change. And yeah, I'm just really looking forward to the next question where you can tell us a little bit more about the conservation measures specifically for this habitat. So that's excellent. Thank you ever so much. Ray, are we all right to hear your take on this, please?
Yes, well, I'm one of the older members of the panel here. I'm old enough to remember the great smogs. I'm looking at Pat here. No, Pat, you're still a youth, aren't you? You don't remember any great smogs. I was brought up in northeast Derbyshire, not very far down the road from a ghastly smokeless, so-called smokeless fuel plant. And I was a very young member of the Northeast Derbyshire Field Club. And we used to go out on expeditions and record things. And I discovered these sorts of strange grey powder in some of the crevices on some of the gritstone walls. And I was told, this is a lichen. Well, this is amazing. It's the only lichen there was. Oh, and a little bit of Lecanora canaisioides. And then I got more interested in mosses and liverworts, and somebody took me under their wing and said they'd heard a rumor, but I was under no circumstances was to tell anybody else that there was actually some Ivernia prunastri somewhere in the Peak District, and then I could go and look at it. And I did. I went there. I got my parents to drive me there. This was the only known colony of Ivernia prunastri in the whole of the Peak District. So we start off from that very low level, and I did my university years were in Manchester. I taught at Manchester Grammar, but I couldn't cope with Manchester. The smogs. I mean, there'd been thousands of people killed in by these smogs in London in the 50s, and of course the Clean Air Acts had then come in, and it was starting to clean up a bit. But this was still a great lichen desert. There was hardly anything left, even in the Peak District. And I was glad to get out and get a job in Wales. And when I got to Wales, I was just blown away by the lichens, and I thought, wow, this is it. I'm amazed by this. And I got involved in recording lichens. Peter James was very helpful. Pat was around. You know, I was very fortunate in that era. But all of a sudden, we ended up with some other interesting problems. Acid rain appeared to be overwhelming us. The Forestry Commission and private forestry planted up vast areas of uplands, and the rivers were all becoming so acidic they were incapable of supporting fish. And I was asked, well, what impact were they having on the plants? Well, the only plants, so-called plants in there were a few bryophytes and obviously the lichens. So I got involved in that, got dragged in then to the first conference held on acid rain in Wales, and from that helped out with Friends of the Earth, who were very, very active then and very effective, dragged down to conferences. And we battled on, and eventually the sulfur dioxide levels were curbed, dropped, and I began to see lichens spreading back into my beloved Derbyshire again. But I'd by now moved into mid-Wales and was providing advice on lichen management across a wider area, including into Herefordshire, where I was beginning to worry about the impact of ammonia. I was seeing all these xanthoria, everything had gone orange or grey over there, battling with Moccas Park, trying to agree on management strategies for Moccas. Large sums of money were having to be exchanged in order to reduce the artificial fertilizer uses, reduce the stocking densities. Herefordshire was becoming completely overwhelmed in big poultry units at that stage. There were 2 or 3 big firms based in Hereford. And then along comes the interesting issue of the battery cages and the banning of battery cages. And all of a sudden, the big chicken farms broke up in Herefordshire. Herefordshire had some rather feeble policies about intensive livestock units, but Powys didn't. And so as a result, what were one or two very big battery units in Herefordshire suddenly fragmented and appeared as small egg-producing units scattered across Powys, where Powys County Council, run by farmers, for farmers, was happy to take hold of anything that would keep the sons and daughters employed on the farm. And that set a trend. And then Cargill's moved into Hereford, a big American firm employing nearly 1,000 people processing chickens. So, I thought there might be a limit on the eggs, but yeah, there may well have been. But of course, chicken meat took over, and they're now supplying ready cooked meals to the rest of the world. And now in Powys, over the last 5 to 6 years, we've ended up with over 9 million chickens. And so I've started to see big impacts on some of my beloved lichens that I've been monitoring for 30, 40 years. Anthropocene ciliaris struggles on in 1 or 2 places. I'm trying to work out from the APIS, this air pollution information service, very useful. It gives you an average ammonia concentration, for example, for a 5 by 5 kilometre square. Can I relate that to the way in which the lichens are performing? Very difficult. I've lost now one site to Anthropocene ciliaris, right on an estuary right beside a cattle unit. It's lived happily with the cattle overwintering in a barn next door to it for many years, but a big chicken farm down the road, the tenants of that particular the farm with the cattle have got so fed up with the smell of chicken manure that they've moved out. And so we're struggling to see now, this is the next big challenge, is can we curb, and natural resources wells have finally got to grips perhaps a little, and it's up to us lichenologists now to provide levels that we think would be acceptable, and then hopefully they might implement them.
That's really great, Ray. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. The surge of this intensive poultry and these livestock units is a subject of real concern, and the negative impacts of ammonia has been widely documented, and it is just so interesting to hear your perspective on this, particularly over in Wales, where this intensification does seem to be particularly pertinent. So, yep, huge thank you for that, Ray. And Neil, over to you. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Unmute. Yeah.
I should be okay now. Yeah.
Brilliant.
I've worked in
Thanks,
lots of
Neil.
different habitats, but Francis Rose started me off in woodlands, so that's my natural home, I think. So I'll do woodlands. But I'm getting a pattern developing here. I mean, I think everything everyone else has said applies to woodlands, and perhaps we can go on. No, but essentially, it's habitat loss and quality decline, pollution and climate change, and that's your main problems, I think. But and as I said, pollution, SO2 is devastating. It's gone now, so policy can work. And as Peter said, nitrogen deposition. I struggle to get my head around nitrogen sometimes, but when you're working on trees and bark, I mean, I think it's important to distinguish ammonia pollution, which sort of raises bark pH, from NOx pollution, especially where it gets concentrated long distance dispersal into a place like the Lake District, where it's basically still just acid rain, as far as I can understand it. I mean, the Lake District is pretty heavily suffering under acid rain, whether it's NOx or originally SO2, now it's NOx. I mean, the NOx is declining, but the bad news I heard from one of the Welsh pollution people is that this ammonia from chicken farms is wafting away overall towards Snowdonia, and it's now contributing to more than 50% of the acid rain in Snowdonia. So despite the fact that we're getting ammonia from farms just isn't under control, and it's very much affecting trees. Habitat loss and climate change are a bit linked, I think, because obviously we've had massive climate change before in the past. We've had ice ages, was that 15 degrees change in temperature or something like that. And everything seemed to do all right, but that's because we had intact habitat networks, as they're called nowadays. So I think one big thing with climate change is we've just fragmented the landscape so much that response is going to be more difficult to see how response works. But I think Britain's very interesting for that, because when did the Anthropocene start in Britain? I mean, was it when the last mammoth departed? I'm not sure. It's certainly been pretty man-influenced since then. So I'm not sure the Holocene and the Anthropocene are not the same thing sometimes, but I'm a biodiversity person. So, but I mean, Chris done some wonderful work. He's got a paper with Brian showing woods in 1860, and where they've shrunk in the Highlands, they're still richer than woods that were at the same size in 1860. You see an extinction debt, which is sort of very important. You see the impact of fragmentation. One sort of things struck me about Britain is how big does a site have to be for things to survive? Because woodland loss hasn't been linear in Britain. It hasn't continued down. It was front loaded. We lost a hell of a lot of woodland in the Bronze Age and up to the Iron Age. And a lot of sites have been fragmented since then. So how big do they have to be, and how does it work? You know, the New Forest woods that I showed you, I didn't see it very well on that slide, unfortunately, but that pattern of woodland is actually established in the Bronze Age. The heathland is growing on abandoned Bronze Age farmland. Some of the woodlands have had nothing in them archaeologically, and Holland says they've been woodlands continuously. But that pattern of separation, the whole complex is probably just one complex over that time frame, but you know, what the next pasture woodland was 10, 20 kilometers away, the next really big old growth woodland. So how did it work in the past? Was it long distance dispersal, exchanging gene pools? You know, what's the sort of smallest size we can get away with, sustainable long-term size of woodland? I don't think anyone's actually even worked on that, how you would work on that, but it's something we'd have to think about. But I think Britain's been fragmenting habitat for so long, it's something we need to think about. I think I'm probably about done with my initial notes. But,
Yes.
That's
So great and very interesting.
That's
Thanks,
great.
Neil. Yeah.
Because I know you'll have a lot more to say later, Neil.
So from listening to everyone speak, it really does seem that climate change and pollution, habitat loss, habitat degradation is a common theme across all of our important lichen habitats. And it's been mentioned, and I think it's really important to hit home what you were saying, Neil, that each of these threats, they don't really act in isolation, but they are so linked and so interconnected. And it really does make species and habitat conservation very, very complex. So, yep, thank goodness we've got all of you panelists involved to push that forward. Very good. Guys, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you ever so much. So this is going to bring me on to the second question. And that is, what are the conservation issues and the conservation measures that we need to address to protect these lichens and these habitats going forward? So Chris, are we all right to start with you again?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I suppose I might be a little controversial. It's probably not very controversial for this audience, but for some audiences it might be a little controversial. And I'm going to suggest that we've got quite an important paradox or potential conflict between environmentalism on the one hand and species conservation on the other hand, particularly in the UK. So environmental conservation versus species conservation or biodiversity conservation. Because on the one hand, we see a need for kind of really large scale solutions to things like climate change. And that's a problem that isn't going to be solved by kind of tinkering around the edges, but we need really, really expansive change, and that includes change to our landscapes. But then on the other hand, we've got to address a biodiversity crisis, and that biodiversity crisis, because of the extent to which biodiversity is kind of, as Neil was alluding to, it's over thousands and thousands of years, it's been increasingly squeezed in the UK. Solutions are often quite small scale. They're remedial actions at a population scale or a habitat scale or even the scale of a single tree. So for many of those very threatened species, we're probably not yet in a position to let nature take care of itself in some kind of grand rewilding, but we need to recover the populations of these threatened species up to a point where they become sustainable. And so this expansive response to things like climate change and the detailed need for kind of habitat actions, I think they can too easily come into conflict, and actually they kind of need to support one another. So we heard yesterday, Brian Edwards was talking about it, and Neil talked about it, this example of massive tree planting in the UK and this ambition to plant billions of trees by 2050. And it's a great example and that's driven by emissions targets. So the primary governmental driving force is, of course, emissions targets, but it's a great opportunity to help solve climate change and improve biodiversity. But as we've heard in the talks, we could so easily get that wrong unless the decision makers are prepared to focus on detail. What trees should we plant? Where should they be planted? The spatial distribution of those trees, and then how they should be managed. These are all local decisions. And it was interesting to hear Neil talk about the interconnectedness of climate change and habitat management. And I agree that I think that's really important. These new woodlands, we need them to create the kind of microclimates that will help lichen species, for example, to cope with future climate change. So we need to be thinking now about that woodland structure and how we can engineer into these woodlands the kind of conditions that will help species cope with climate change in 2050, 2080, 2100. So there's an awful lot of lichen biology in getting that response right. And so I think there's a challenge in making decision makers who are thinking at these very broad scales with these very big numbers, and they're focused on, you know, putting 1 million trees into the landscape, to also focus on the detail. And I think that is over the next decade, that's going to be one of the biggest challenges, actually, kind of making the biodiversity crisis, which often depends on these local solutions, meet with the solutions to climate change.
Thank you, Chris. That was just mind-blowing. And what you said about this paradox with regards to how you have this conflict between environmental conservation and also biodiversity conservation really does just make me think how important and crucial it is that we prioritise our conservation efforts. And I'm sure this will resonate with so many people in the audience. It is really clear that I think each and every person has this responsibility, especially when it comes to lobbying these decision makers, to make sure that decisions are made that do favour our lichens and their very special habitats. So that was an incredibly strong message. Thank you so much. That was excellent. And Peter, what's your take on this question? Oh, you're on mute.
Muted. You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Excellent.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah, specifically, again, focusing on heathlands and perhaps focusing on the two major threats. I'll deal with the easier one first. Moderation of grazing pressure, in theory, is a relatively straightforward process, bearing in mind that we do need to produce food. But nonetheless, in key areas, in key habitats, and particularly northern Scotland, a moderation of deer density, for example, would have major effects on promoting lichen growth. But even more widely, that could have major benefits. And in fact, introducing moderate grazing into heathlands is a very widespread practice. Neil is an expert on this, I know. Most wildlife trusts, or well, many, have their own herds of sheep or cattle which they rotate around their heathland sites. But and there are other management practices which can be introduced, and Neil has pointed out to me that burning also reduces the nitrogen content of heathlands. But countering the effects of nitrogen pollution is a major challenge, and we're swimming against the tide, really. But nonetheless, there are approaches that have been taken. They're pretty draconian. Mowing, for example, the idea is to remove nitrogen. So mowing heather, but the key thing is to take those cuttings away, cutting turf and taking that turf away, reducing the nitrogen capital in these ecosystems, are some of the methods which have been not only suggested but actually applied. They damage lichen populations for sure, but they do tend to conserve the heathland habitat, which would otherwise be lost. Now, I can give you an anecdote here, if I could, another anecdote, not from so far away this time, but we used to take students to Cannock Chase. I think I did this about 3 or 4 years on the run. It's a major area of heathland. It has a European designation. It's a European area of conservation, or European special area of conservation. Now, I don't know whether that changes because we're not in the EU anymore. And it's the designation is for its dry heaths and its North Atlantic wet heaths. It's a very large area of heathland in the Midlands, in the county of Staffordshire. The lichen populations there are not, or the lichen communities are not brilliant, but we used to take students there to show them the steps that were being taken to conserve heathland. And I used to talk each year to the county ecologist for Staffordshire about this, a very nice lady. Although she was the ecologist for Staffordshire, she spent almost 100% of her time managing Cannock Chase because of the huge amount of work that all these processes took. They mowed, they cut turf, they grazed, they burnt. They also had a phytophthora infestation problem. She was always extremely stressed when I talked to her on the phone. It's a huge, huge undertaking, but they were nonetheless doing it. And you could see little patches of Cladonia portentosa coming up here and there, you know, where they had undertaken some of these. And the aim there was to maintain that heathland habitat. Now, just one other sort of semi-optimistic note, here in Nottinghamshire, they have generated heathlands de novo on old coal spoil heaps. They've capped them with sand, and this has been done with money from the mining industry. The Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust has been involved, and this has generated impressive areas of heather. You know, several hectares of it, as far as you can see, and in within the heather canopy, there are bryophyte and lichen populations developing. So this is an experiment. The nitrogen capital in those systems is very low. Now, you know, in 100 years' time, it may be different. But you know, this does offer. It's an interesting experiment that might offer one means of at least conserving the concept of heathland in a nitrogen polluted era.
Thanks, Peter. That's excellent. It's really interesting what you were saying about the management of these habitats, because heathlands are actually a habitat of great controversy. You know, they are a huge financial commitment to maintain these habitats, and I guess with heaths you are constantly battling ecological succession. So you mentioned that obviously these might not be SACs under new environmental policy after leaving the EU, but it will be interesting to see how these heathlands do fare under these new environmental policies post-Brexit. So yeah, brilliant, thank you. And what about yourself, Ray?
Right, well, yes, interesting. I'm fascinated by Neil's talk as well. Yes, the problems that we're having with conserving such iconic species as labarias, for example, did the trouble start in the Bronze Age? I mean, looking at all my sites now, 29, 30 sites for labaria species in Brecon and Radnor. I've lost a third of them in the 40 years I've been looking at. I've only got one site in which the Labaria pulmonaria appears to have successfully colonized. In all the remaining sites, I don't give the existing colonies a cat in hell's chance. The next nearest suitable tree is too far away, because it was Christoph, wasn't it? Christoph Scheidecker. I remember, I think I was fascinated by his work on labarias. Was it Switzerland? I think somewhere like that.
But
yeah.
Across the world now.
Yeah, right. Well, his opinion was that if you had a site with fewer than 15 trees that supported something like Labaria pulmonaria, it was functionally dead. There would be enough stochastic cataclysmic effects that would eliminate. So I've borne that in mind, and I've been looking at, well, where do we concentrate our efforts in Wales? And we've probably got 3 sites which, left to their own devices, the species might survive in. So I'm now left thinking, do I help? and I've started trying to work out whether I can grow things like Liberia easily. Yes, they're dead easy. I've got wonderful specimens growing in the garden here. I've got wonderful specimens now growing in the Welsh Botanic Garden, over a foot across, 18 inches across some of the Liberia pulmonaria. It's just growing like cabbages. There is no problem in growing these things in the atmosphere that we've now got over a lot of Wales. The big problem is it doesn't seem to reproduce anymore. And perhaps we understood from Claudia's talk yesterday about the infra-specific variation in things like Sauridicipiens. You know, have I just not got the right mating strains? I found one fertile frond once in all of mid Wales. So, you know, I think if I don't step in, I might lose whatever diversity might exist in mid Wales before it's gone. We've now lost Liberia amplissima, as far as I can see, from virtually all of mid and southern Wales. Scabiculators on its way out. You know, and so I think intervening is something that we're going to have to seriously think about. I'm not very impressed by these wonderful words like, oh yes, connectivity is the answer. I've looked at things like the colonization of new hedgerows, some old hedgerows after 40, 50 years now. There's no movement of anything along that hedge. The bluebells haven't moved a foot. So, I mean, planting these hedges to link these two woodlands together, what the hell is ever going to crawl along them? I mean, there might be a few mice and but they're going to walk through the tall grass anyway. I mean, it's all a bit of a, and yet, I mean, looking at the devil is often in the detail, and I can now state categorically that slugs and snails are our #1 enemy. They wiped out some of my most important populations of Anaptyssus ciliaris in January, February 2016, 2017 because of Chris's problems of climate change. We didn't have a single frost in January. They had 18 hours of freedom, and they demolished even 6 8-inch long Gramiline Fraxinia colonies. Those trees are now entirely bare. There's nothing on them. Even in February last year, I counted 16 slugs and snails browsing in pure daylight. I'd never seen that before. So looking at, you know, these are these subtle, the little changes, but they all add up. And maybe we are going to have to do what many of the mammalogists are doing, breeding populations, supporting them. I don't know. It's a shame. And I was hoping that we might we got the atmospheric pollution right in terms of acidity. Well, we're on the way. And that's now allowing Liberias to spread. But I think it's got too far when they're going to have help if we're not going to lose some of these local populations, which might be quite interestingly different. Okay.
Thank you, Ray. Gosh, it is such a privilege to hear you speak about the value of translocations. I know it's something that you've been hugely involved with throughout your life. And yeah, I'm in total agreement with you that our lichens do need a bit of a helping hand from time to time. And I mean, in a lot of cases, translocations really are the last resort in terms of salvaging lichen material. So yeah, keep up the good work.
Thank you.
And Neil, over to you.
Okay, I muted myself, right. Well, I think we're talking about woodland, just talking about the twin evils of intensification and abandonment. And from abandonment, you get what I call homogenization. So I think we'll deal with the abandonment side of it. Obviously, you know, intensification just removes all the interest. So, you know, but I think there's a very good Danish paper on sand dunes, which I borrowed a lot when I was doing the New Forest Heathlands study, that there's a phenomenon of nature reserves and protective designation simply not working. You know, the habitat's still there, but the species are disappearing. Yeah, those species survive hundreds of years, millennia of being managed by subsistence farmers and then low energy commercial farmers who knew nothing about it. You know, they weren't interested at all unless they could eat it. But all this rare biodiversity survived quite happily with no attention whatsoever. It's now in nature reserves, in protective areas. It's supposed to be cared for, and it's going extinct still, you know. It seems it's quite a widespread thing. I mean, I would say, you know, Chris's thing, slightly diverge onto heathland, that we have a term in the New Forest, we call them, you know, nature reserve grazing. It doesn't resemble our grazing at all, and it doesn't seem to work terribly well. We've still got peasants doing it, but we've also got a huge scale. So I was standing on one site talking about lichens to someone from Surrey and saying how the poor soils here next to the rich grazing were grazed short, and you got fire resistant lichens surviving because there's no fires there. Just tell him how pointing over the horizon and saying, you know, the grazing pressure reduces as you go over that way, and then you get into heather that cycles through and is burnt and things like that. It's a different behavior. And he turned around and saying, you know, you're pointing over a larger area of heathland than we've got in Surrey, the whole of Surrey. So scale, yeah, is difficult, but I think there's, I check my notes. I think it's just a problem that we don't seem to get reproduce what was done accidentally and produce this massive biodiversity, despite a huge amount of disturbance of the early Anthropocene or the pre-Anthropocene Holocene in Britain. You know, we still had a very diverse situation, but even when we're trying to conserve it, we're not terribly good at it. I mean, research should think you get there eventually, but. And you also get that's part of shifting baselines, isn't it? Because you know, we haven't lost a single species to anything but pollution. We've lost a lot of cyanobacteria species in the New Forest woodlands, but we've now found every single crustose species that they found in the 19th century. It took some time. What was it? Either Arthonia anglica or Arthropyrini nitida, I think, were the last 6 standing ones. But, the ones I believe, anyway, there are records I think are fake. Like many gets here, but you know that the scale of that site still managed without really much care for conservation. There's a lot of conservationists tell us that we're managing the forest terribly badly, overgrazing it and all this sort of thing, but nothing's going extinct. And I mean, looking at woodlands, and Jan von Drack's done some amazing work on these hotspots, looking at 1 hectare plots. We saw pictures of it from Andy's thing, where he pours these high quality lichenologists into 1 hectare and imprisons them there for a day and sees what they find. You know? But it's beginning to get results across Europe, and we've got some papers under review on that. And I mean, what he's finding is glades is in woodlands. It's absolutely broken canopies, broken shrub layers, small glades, big glades. Some of them can look like high forests, like the restoring 19th century plantation that Dave showed, but they're not got 3 layers like a tropical rainforest diagram, you know, and there's light coming through. It's basically a competitive exclusion. And if you take out the grazing, you get competitive exclusion. You get the trees taking all the light, the shrub layer takes the light below that. And that seems to be an absolutely critical thing in woodlands. And we have this great fashion we have had certainly in Central Europe for non-intervention woodlands, where if the animals are grazing this regeneration to actually affect it, then that's unnatural. And this is showing up very much in Jan's figures that, you know, Central Europe has got very depressed diversity within even its hotspots within old growth woodlands, because they're just solid beech woods or spruce woods with no glades and no light at the bottom. You know, so this is the sort of thing that goes on. And you get, as I say, shifting baselines that they don't really know what the old pasture woodlands that these non-intervention plots replaced look like now, because they haven't got any left. You know, it's a completely alien concept. So this is what happens in a lot of habitats, I think. And check, was anything else I was going to say? I think I've rambled through most of it. Yeah, I mean, the interesting stuff from Jan's work is that New Forest was one of the richest sites he's had in lowland Europe, and the west of Scotland ones were the second richest areas. And the richest areas are grazed woodlands in the Western Caucasus, I think, which are unbelievably rich. It's about 500 species in a hectare, something ridiculous. Might be 400, I can't remember, something like that.
Yeah.
That's so brilliant, Neil. Thank you. My gosh, your depth of knowledge with woodlands in the UK and in the continent is just so inspiring. So thank you for that. And
I mean, one thing I just see, I mean, we're watching this Ukrainian site, you do get these hotspots in these natural, you know, non-intervention woods, but you have to be clambering down a cliff face, basically one of the sites we did, and the other one was at the edge of a river, where a river cut through. But then you go through this incredible beech wood, where you had beech canopy, a few straggly beech trees as a shrub there, and then the ground floor was beech seedlings. I'm not joking. Some brave Ukrainian women went through and did about 300 plots for lichens, and they were averaging five lichens a tree in these areas.
God.
And then we found the rich spots. We got up, I think we got nearly 300 lichens on the tree line site, which is still grazed. And there are 50 lichens per tree, sort of thing. Yeah.
That's
But
brilliant.
there are anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk about the more sort of traditionally grazed woodlands and the ones in the New Forest being the richest in Europe, which actually makes me feel unusually patriotic. But what I
Lowland
think
Europe, yeah.
is a big question is how do we translate the importance of suitable grazing and browsing levels within these habitats to people who are managing woodlands on the ground. You know, there seems to be a bit of a blockage in this communication because at the moment people think that exclosures need to go up and keep the grazers out.
One thing I'm missing when I notice is I think the answer is there's no level of grazing which is suitable for a habitat. There's no one level of grazing.
Yeah.
And the New Forest has certainly worked on cyclic grazing. One of the problems we have is grazing is under threat because the people who do it are getting older. There aren't so many young people in. You support them with money, and then they start turning out slightly too many animals. I mean, we've got slightly on the top edge at the moment. So what we need to do is somehow bring the animals down, but then not crash the community so they just give up.
Yeah.
So the real long-term danger is we lose the grazing altogether. But the immediate danger is we try and support the grazing artificially, and then that means it goes up too much.
Yeah.
And in the old days, it just worked because there was a depression and everyone got unemployed and went to the cities or something, you know.
Yeah, you need a few plagues, occasional plagues.
Yes, cattle plague came through and things like this, you know. So you need a random computer generator to sort of work out how the numbers should be or something. But, so I think the answer is there's no suitable levels for these things, you know. And you just have to.
It's interesting that we're going through a phase in Mid Wales here now where I can't get most of the nature reserves grazed because of TB. So there's a plague that's reduced the grazing pressure quite substantially. You know, I don't know, we'll just have to move over to some other organism or hopefully get some of them vaccinated, and then we can get back to some grazing levels again.
And there's a real problem with what you're using for grazing, isn't there? Because to introduce animals from a strange place, you know, they don't know the place. I've had woods like that I've worked in, like Tacannell, where the animals, you know, then it's not extensive grazing anymore. You've brought these animals in, they're strangers, they stick in one area, they don't graze the whole lot. So it's also our animals, isn't it, that we're using?
Yeah.
Type of animal.
Well, there's probably a cultural continuity in New Forest ponies as well, which goes back for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So how anyway, we're degenerating into discussion, aren't we?
I forgot we had an audience. I'm just getting so engrossed in this conversation. So we are rapidly running out of time. It's now 4:45.
And I've got lots of questions.
I think you're right, Pat. Can we spend 1 minute each just discussing and chatting and sharing your opinions of is there hope for lichens in a very rapidly changing environment? So Chris, if we start with you on that one, just a short 1 minute each, please, everybody.
Yeah, I think we've got to say definitely, of course, and I would just reflect on this meeting. So we've seen we've got the science and we've got the kind of the talent within the science base, including lots of young, talented master's students, PhD students doing like the kind of work that we need that we need. We've got the incredible field knowledge in the British Lichen Society, which is just, that is the core of the society. I mean, it's incredible, detailed knowledge of lichens and lichen biology in the field. The diversity of people that contribute. I mean, we've got people working within the agencies who can help us to kind of, who can guide us into creating those solutions that bridge between the broad scale and the local scale. So there are people to help us advocate for that and get that right. Then, I mean, there's the advocacy itself, there's the EPC, and that the way that runs from increasing broader enthusiasm around lichens to things like arts and communicating in different ways. So I think while we've got all those ingredients, there has to be hope, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, Chris, that's great. Thank you. Peter, what about you? Is there hope for lichens in a changing environment? Oh, you're on mute. Peter, you're on mute.
On mute.
Where's the management team here? I realised I was going to put my generating heathlands on colliery spoil forward as a note of optimism, but I've already played that card. You have to know there's a problem there before you can solve it, and I think the Lichen Society is extremely good at. We've got the resources to identify these problems. There are going to be habitat losses. I think the future for heathlands is not good unless there is tremendous effort, and that probably is only going to apply to one or two areas, Cannock Chase, for example, which is a huge area that I've already seen, because we've surveyed lots of heathlands, not for lichens, but in some other project, that heathlands are disappearing in many areas. But again, if you know there's a problem there, you have something to fight for. And of course, the first people to blow the whistle on this were the Dutch, whose heathlands just vanished. And that was before the problem really was appreciated. The heathlands were turned into grasslands under their noses, and they blew the whistle on this. And then we realized, hey, the same thing's happening in East Anglia in the Breckland, and Rob Marrs published papers, and so if we know there's that problem, there is hope, because we can fight for it. But yeah, I'm sorry. And just one thing about nitrogen pollution, of course, hydrogen is a fantastic possibility in the future, but a hydrogen flame will generate NOx. It's not an entirely clean fuel. Wherever we have combustion, we have pollution.
Thank you, Peter. Over to you, Ray. Is there hope for our lichens?
Well, I think yes, just because of the existence and the effectiveness and efficiency of the British Lichen Society. There we are creating a new flora. We need that as the basis to identify species, to get new people involved. And we've got the database, we've got a red data book, which we do need to rather urgently update, because if we're going to bring it in to be of use in public inquiries, it can't be dated, because the inspectors will say, well, this is all out of date. People have been recording lichens for the last 5 or 6 years. We can't pay much attention to this. So we've got to do, there's a few priorities that we need to address. But by and large, because I've moved on, I'm afraid, I've tried to drag up the rest of the rest of the fungal kingdom. I mean, you look at the rest of it, considering that the fungi outnumber virtually everything else. Crikey, we've got a hell of a way to go with the rest of the kingdom of the fungi. But we and the lichens are so far ahead of it all. So I've been just dragging out the microfungi and the red data books of smut fungi, for God's sake, just trying to get those up to a level that we achieved 20, 25, 30 years ago with the lichens. So yeah, keep going, folks. The money's in the kitty there. Let's get the grey literature sorted out so we don't lose all that. Let's get the momentum going and train up a lot more people, because botany, that's what frightens me more than anything. The students that I come into contact with today are so hopeless. It just can't be believed. The last 3 years, I haven't found a student doing biological sciences that's ever seen peas in a pod. I've given up hoping they would know what a pea flower looks like. And when it comes to things like mosses, liverworts, forget it. They don't even know what a daisy is. So, I'm fascinated that Alan Friday still is in a department that has botany in its title, for God's sake. Have we got any left in this country? I don't think so. We haven't got a mycology department per se. So the society is so very important. Please, everybody, do your best. You are doing amazingly. I just can't believe how much you managed to achieve on such small amounts of cash and whatever.
Great, that's lovely.
They're
Thank
brilliant.
you so much. And Neil, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, yes, there's always hope. Yeah, clean cars are coming, so transport pollution, which is is going to go down. That's got to be good. I think the rewilding movement, has got a lot of positive elements in it. I think it's actually rather in sites that are already large scale. Ray's problem where you've got functional extinction is, and you've got to really step in. But I think once we get back to big sites, then the sort of rewilding thing might work better than many the sort of the 20th century nature reserve concept. I'm quite hopeful about that, though I personally call it recommoning rather, and make sure that people are involved, and land managers and farmers are still eating animals off it. You know. But I'm not quite keen on Serengeti or Yellowstone, where you drive the native people out at the point of the alliance with the 7th Cavalry has actually happened in Yellowstone. And also, I mean, final note, recently exploring sites that suffer from SO2 acidification, which you've heard some of them already at Burnham Beaches, and finding amazing stuff that has astonishingly survived. Windsor Forest as well. We got several trees with Lecanora sublividescens, which was last recorded in the 19th century. So, and I think that you know, lichens are tough. God, what they did lose from Windsor Forest, God only knows. It's completely gone, but presumably Liberia, etc. But yeah, it's there, and it comes back. So there's hope. Yeah.
Well, here's a question from Henk Timmerman for you, Neil. So I thought we'll just get onto a few of these questions because they're really interesting. So
yeah, the debate is fascinating.
Timmerman says, here's a thought-provoking question. Species that are completely new to science are popping up in the Netherlands, of course, in habitats that are mainly very much influenced or even created by mankind. Specialists have said to us that these species most likely are not undiscovered species from other regions that have made their way to Europe. Examples are Apegrapha viridi pruinosa and Hyperphysia lucida. Anybody got any comments on that? I mean, the Netherlands is a special case, isn't it?
I found Virida pruinosa growing in wound tracks on ancient beech trees and old growth woodland. Yeah. So, you know,
so you think that
there's nothing to say that it didn't appear from somewhere else and arrive there out of the polluted areas. But, you know, I mean, a lot of the pollution lichen things I can still find in pretty clean air areas like the New Forest, but they're growing in very special habitats where there's nitrogen leaking out of the trees. So that one I suspect might have been around in odd enriched wound tracks habitats, and obviously other things. Some lichens do amazing long distance dispersal and some don't, you know. It's quite a difficult thing to get across because we tend to emphasize the ones that don't do the dispersal very well. You know? Yeah. I mean, some of the things I was talking about, a lot of the widespread old growth species are quite plainly not dispersal limited at all in the New Forest context. And that includes things like Brown Hibernica, you know, which is, people think, a pretty rare thing, but as soon as the trees are old enough, it colonizes. So it's just waiting for the trees to get old enough. But it's not colonizing 5 kilometers away to our developing old growth woodland with 5 kilometers of separation. So, but then clearly some of them can blow across the continent, you know, and we've had quite a few that have obviously come across from Europe, you know, across the Channel. So yeah, there's lots of exciting things could happen. I was just wondering, so partly my ramblings about how big do the woods have to be, in, you know, in terms of the long-term fragmentation, was the New Forest occasionally dispersing spores to the Forest of Beer, which then dispersed to St. Leonard's Forest, you know, jumping of tens of kilometers every so often. So there was some sort of spread over hundreds of years, you know.
April, if it's all right, I've got an interesting question from Dave Lamacroft. Or do you think we've got to wrap this up?
I think there's just enough time for one more question, to be honest. I don't want this discussion to ever end.
Well, we've got loads of questions, people, so I don't know what to do. But Dave Lamacroft says, it feels like there's a steadily increasing awareness of the world of lichens, generally and more specifically. Oh, God, it's popped out. It's gone. Where's it gone? Damn. This is what these answers do. Okay, here we are. In terms of potential in medicine, do you think we're scratching the surface on the potential uses and applications of lichens, lichen compounds, and how may this help in the conservation of lichens and their habitats? Chris.
Thanks, Pat. Nice, easy question. I think that's really unpredictable. I think the kind of work that we've heard about genomes and genome sequencing and metagenomics, if we're gonna take lichens into some kind of new application, that's probably where it's going to come from. Yeah. I wouldn't rely on it. Yeah. If it did happen, then I guess it would raise the profile of lichens, but then you're caught in the, I guess you're caught in that debate about, you know, it's a bit, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and it's probably a bit of a caricature, but then you hit the debate about, you know, does hunting lions actually protect lions? Because people about them and they want a population of lions. So
no, we can't
breed
breed lichens.
Well, exactly. So, and even if you did, and you synthesized the whatever compound it might be, and you took it into a pharmaceutical application, then you don't need nature to produce that for you. So if you rely on harvesting lichens in some way for medicine,
you can't do it.
There's a question about sustainable harvesting. And yeah, it's really, I mean, yeah, we could carry on talking about this for.
Yes,
Yeah.
we could. We could. I knew.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure there are other examples of natural products which have resulted in the conservation of their source, you know, plant. Maybe you know of some, but there's so many lichens, and it'd likely be one species. You know, I think it's, yeah, as Chris says, I wouldn't count on it.
So there's Becky popping up. April, have we got to wind up?
Yeah, do you want to wind everything up, Pat,
Yes.
and bring this amazing panel discussion to a close? I think this is just a discussion that everyone has needed to hear today and this year. So yeah, thank you from myself. Just thank you everyone so much. It's been great.
And so, and I've really appreciated, and I think we've got better to learn a bit how to use the Zoom facility, because, you know, we have been able to have a wee bit of a discussion, and I hope there are loads of questions in the Q&As, but we can't do that. But I think, like Chris says, this is a new methodology and we've got to use it in many different ways. So I just want to say thank you all of our contributors, presenters, panelists, everyone. It has been really, really interesting. Thank you from everyone. And over to you. Have I got anything else to say? No, I don't think I have. Over to you, Becky, who's run an amazing AGM.
Well, I need to thank you, April, and you, Pat, for running a fantastic virtual field meeting and panel discussion. As they've said, there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. So if you panelists who are sitting there right now don't mind spending a few minutes going through and answering some questions, that would be fantastic. I have some housekeeping and a lot of thank yous actually. And I have a request for one of my co-hosts. If I could get Helene, can you invite our other helpers back on to be panelists while I'm just doing some wrapping up, please? I'd like to get everybody back on for a huge thank you at the end. So,
could you make me co-host? Because I can't do that.
Yes. Give me just a second. Thank you. There you go. Great. So thank you to the afternoon session. That's really been interesting. And of course, that discussion can go on, and I hope it does. I know that all the speakers would be happy to have questions from you. And if you're not already in contact with those people, then put some questions that you really want answers to the AGM question email. So agm@britishlichensociety.org.uk. So maybe someone can pop that into the chat for everybody for the meeting. I think all the speakers would be really happy to hear from people who've been inspired or inspired to have more questions about their talks. Everybody wants these conversations to continue, and in a normal conference, we'd be able to stand by their posters or with a glass of wine, which of course we can't do this time. So I also need to thank all the speakers across the entire weekend, in particular Professor Rosemary Honegger, who gave us a really wonderful talk. So thank you for coming along and inspiring the next generation. I know there was a good session today in the virtual lounge with students, so I was really glad to hear that went well. I need to invite on my co-organizing team, which is Faye, it's Helene, it's Theo, please turn on your videos, it's Neil, it's Gothamy, it's Esther, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. So come on, videos for all of you. A big round of applause for these people who have helped so much to make this happen this weekend. So I really...
Becky, I would like you to turn my video on, please. Thank you.
Sorry. You know, It's pretty tricky, this. Who are we missing? Have we got everybody? I think we do. So thank you all for joining us and helping to make this really smooth. In addition to all of you on the committee, there were also lots of other helpers, Janet and Clara and Brian Edwards. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. I'm going to go through just to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Peter Crittenden.
You've missed my team in the lounge, Becky.
Team in your lounge. Faye, tell us about
Pete and Mark. Thank you very much to Pete and Mark.
Thank you for doing the lounge, Faye. I was only able to drop in on Saturday. I hope a lot of people benefited from that. I think it was a really nice opportunity. So thank you for doing all of this, everybody. It's a really special opportunity. Of course, all the members of the British Lichen Society and everybody else who's here, 142 at this very moment in time. And over the weekend, I've seen that number go well over 200. I can't remember if it went over 300, but anyway, a lot of people have been here taking part. And so thanks to all of you. The talks have been recorded. The entire series of talks have been recorded and we're storing those in the cloud. And for those of you who've agreed to share your talk, thank you very much. We'll try to make those available as soon as we can. If anybody in the audience is particularly interested in video editing or particularly skilled, boy, would we love to hear from you. So honestly, if you have some time and interest, if you benefited from this, please get in touch if you could volunteer a little bit to help us. Judith, I didn't mention you. Judith has been a really important helper too. So please, again, AGM at britishlichensociety.org.uk. If you can help get those videos up for other people to hear or for you to hear again, that would be great. Let's see. So the last thing I want to say is normally we would be standing around and having a huge round of applause and then glasses of wine and canapes. Of course, we can't do that this time. What I'll do is leave the chat open. So if you don't know about the chat, in the bottom of the control window on your Zoom window, there's a thing that says chat with a little speech bubble. I'm going to turn that on and anybody can chat to anybody from now. So I'm going to leave this on for, I don't know, 15, 30 minutes. I might not be here the whole time, but you may be able to go through that list of attendees and talk to each other just briefly. If you can't or are not able to do that, please consider picking up the telephone, call someone you haven't talked to for a long time. You know, everybody loves to get a little phone call from a friend and a colleague. So thank you so much to everybody. I think this has been a tremendous success. I've had a lot of feedback from all sorts of different methods from Twitter and email, thanking all of you for being here and helping. So I pass that back to the committee. Thank you all. I think it's been wonderful. So well done, BLS. And please feel free to join the chat now. I'm going to turn my video off and I formally close the meeting, but I'll leave the chat open. So thank you, everybody.
But before you
Becky,
go, Becky,
before you disappear,
you go,
Becky, before you disappear, that the committee on the BLS, we all like to send our grateful thanks to you, putting all this together. You've been wonderful with the committee and all the members. Becky, without you, I don't think that any of us would have gone this track. And you put us all together. So big thanks should go to you. And I know that a lot of pressure could be lifting away from your shoulder at the moment. So you will have a very peaceful good night's sleep today, have a glass of wine, enjoy your evening. It's done, and it is very successfully done, Becky. Thank you to you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. I hope to see you all in person very soon.
Yes, good night, Becky. Wow.
Are you excited about the award and hope that April will come and visit you very soon with the award?
God. Well, I was so amazed because I hadn't really thought about it. When you said I had to stay on, I thought, oh, there must be something I've missed. And I never had time to look it up because we were busy trying to trial
And I apologize for keeping that secret for so long, but there was no other way that I could ask you to wait longer. I was afraid that you would leave before the award ceremony.
Anyhow, it's been very emotional meeting, and so, you know, to see so many people, and actually to start with Rosemary, whom I haven't seen for ages, and so it was very special, got to me, and I loved your talk. I thought, that is me.
No, that the credit should also go to Brian and Sandy, because they did the fine tuning and editing of that talk, which I prepare. So thanks to Brian and Sandy.
No wonder Sandy's been very short with me.
This still might be online.
Oh yes, we are, because we're chatting.
Right. Yeah, but it's great. I mean, it's been lovely hearing what you could have just said.
What? So wait a minute. I'm on gallery view, but we just don't see them, do we? So this is.
Can you hear me, Pat? It's Ray here.
Yes, I can hear you, Ray.
I've been switched off, so I can't come back on the video. I've been switched off, but you can hear me. I just want to say thank you for my bedtime reading, this wonderful book on atmospheric ammonia. I can start my video. You can see it. It's a real stonker of a book. Thank you, Pat, for sending it.
It's arrived.
It's arrived.
Oh, God.
Yes, that's really great. So
I didn't even.
Hold it up. Can you hold it up again, Ray? Sorry. Can you hold it up again?
Hold it up. Oh, yes, there we are.
Atmospheric
ammonia.
Yeah, that one. Yes. Oh God, I've started to read the first chapter. Oh God, wet towels around my head, I'm afraid.
No, you just pick and choose, but it is very useful.
That's the alternative reading. What? A Thai American book about the damage caused by the chicken industry. Oh God, that's a real stonker as well. Things lichens get you into.
Yeah, you should read the chapter from Mark Sutton on farm, local, and landscape scale.
Yeah,
I'll
go to that next.
Yeah, that's next.
Get through that.
Got your reading sorted.
Thank you, Pat, for all your organising. It's been wonderful.
No,
Really
I just feel so pleased to see you all. Gosh.
Okay.
And yeah. And Ray, good luck, and I hope I get to Wales soon. I can't bear
you're more than
it.
welcome anytime. Cup of tea on the Rayburn, ready for you.
Pat, you promised to go to Wales to collect some more Graphidaceae.
Graphidaceae, yes.
Yeah. You got to take me there.
Yes.
Well, I'm burning vast quantities at the moment. Keep me warm. More than welcome. I'll peel the bark off. Okay, bye for now then.
Yes, bye, Ray. And yeah. And I'm tempted to go too, because I haven't even had lunch. So
yeah, thank you and bye everyone. It's great to
spend.
And we'll catch up soon. Okay.
I was trying to answer some of these questions on the QA, and the page dances around when somebody answers somebody, the page jumps, and then you lose where you are.
I know, that's what.
Yes, it's irritating, isn't it? You just have to find it again.
So
Peter, I think Helene copied all these questions into a Word document just before you all wrapped up the panel.
Yeah, so but what are we meant to do with that?
I think that eventually, if I'm correct, that they will be directed to the panelists, and I will send a message to Helene, because we have a small WhatsApp group, asking her to email these questions to all of the panelists, including April and Pat. So we can write to people who we didn't answer live. And also that is the main reason why Becky asked Becky asked AGM email to be given to the participants, so they can even reach AGM committee later on with their questions. So they will be definitely forwarded to you. We'll make sure it happens.
That would be good.
I'm off. Thanks, everyone. It's great.
Yeah, and actually, a lot of these are comments. Neil, so good to see you in your new forest habitat. Oh God. Right, I'm off too. Thank you, everybody. What a great weekend. And Judith, thank you so much. Wow, because I couldn't have done that.
Yeah, Judith, thank you. God, you are brilliant. You're on mute. Still on mute, Judith.
Yes, I'm on. Yeah, I'm on.
Yeah, thank you so much for your support today. It's been excellent.
I was copying having learned how to do it, was copying the questions.
Yeah.
Because even if they just put some of them together, they're very interesting thoughts.
Yeah. No, it's just I'm delighted with the conversation and the debate that it's sparked. It's really interesting. What a great afternoon. What a great weekend.
We've still got 27 attendees.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to shoot now.
Can't better go away.
Yep. All right, Judith. Well, you take care.
If many of my Tuesday and Wednesday Zoom groups are there, I'll see them on Tuesday and Wednesday.
Yeah.
And you on Tuesday.
I'll see you on Tuesday, Judith. See you later. Bye, everybody.
Just to say, everybody, I'm shutting her down. Good night. I hope you had a great time, and it's over. Bye.